The economy, Common Core, and immigration are just some of the key issues candidates for Florida governor must contend with. But this race will also come down to one word, and that's trust. We invited our next guest to share his thoughts on this and more. We welcome former U.S. Senator George Lemieux, chair of the board at the Gunster Law Firm. George Lemieux, good to see you.
Always great to be with you, Helen.
Senator, polls are showing that people are conflicted because they don't feel like they can trust either Rick Scott or Charlie Crist.
It's an amazing race. It's going to be the first time, I think, in the history of Florida that if either man wins the governorship, they will go into office more unpopular than popular. And what we're seeing in the polling numbers is that a lot of folks are not showing any enthusiasm, especially Democrats, and that's also trending nationally, are not showing enthusiasm for this race. The new Quinnipiac poll that came out this week showed Scott ahead of Charlie 45-40, but then if you put Adrian Wiley into the mix, that went down to 39-37. I have a lot of respect for Adrian and him running in this race, but really what his number right now, I think, is the none of the above number. So if he gets some attention, that could change. If it doesn't change, what that shows me is that it's most likely those who will show up to vote. Scott's got about a 5-point lead. From here on out, I expect that he spends 2-1 over Charlie Crist between now and Election Day. That's going to be hard to overcome for Crist.
When you look at the Rick Scott record, the state is actually doing better economically. It is moving ahead, and yet he's not as popular as, looking at these economic numbers, you would think he might be. Why?
I think it's because Rick Scott came from outside the process. I mean, we've elected our governors and our senators in the state, usually people who have spent time in public service before, sort of worked their way up the ladder. Rick didn't do that. He came from the private sector, and it was an unusual race. He bankrolled his own campaign. But you're right, Florida is doing a lot better. Could not be more bullish about Florida. I think that the next 10 or 20 years in Florida, with what's happening in Miami, with 70 million baby boomers retiring, 10,000 a day, a lot of them moving south, I think we're going to have a great 10 years. And what Rick has done in a very sort of workmanlike way, not a lot of flash, not a lot of frills, is focused intently on jobs. So I think what the voter's going to look at is who did a better job when they were governor. I think they're going to, if they make that evaluation, they're going to like what they see in Rick Scott. And frankly, Charlie has run so far to the left. He's the only Democrat in America running for major office who's running to Obama, saying that he's going to support Obamacare, saying he's going to raise taxes, saying he's going to do all of the things that really is, I think, out of step with Florida. It's an unusual strategy call on his part, but I think that's going to be a big choice for voters come Election Day in November.
But does Charlie Crist have any other place to go? Because quite frankly, if he doesn't make that political move, what other one could he possibly make? Well,
you know, he's very politically talented, so I have to sometimes think about, criticizing whatever strategy he's undertaking because I know how talented he is. But this is what the analysis, if you want to just hear sort of what would be the campaign analysis, I would think would be given to him prior to this race starting. It would have been be 1 inch to the left of Rick Scott. He needs to capture Republican votes. He needs to capture independent votes. If you stood 1 inch to the left of Rick Scott and said, I'm the same guy, I believe in all the things I've always believed in, but this other guy, is taking us in the wrong direction, that I thought could have been a successful strategy for him. He wasn't going to lose the Democratic nomination. He ran in the Democratic nomination as if he had a substantial, well-funded opponent, and he had to run to the left. He could have stayed in the middle. He chose not to do that, and now he's changed his position on everything from Florida being a right-to-work state. Now he's against the embargo to Cuba. Now he wants to raise taxes. So he's really gone to the left.
And you would know because you worked very closely with Charlie Crist, so he's a very different person from the man you worked with?
He is. I mean, I still hold a place in my heart for him because he gave me so many opportunities for public service. But what he's espousing now as his beliefs is 180 degrees different than what he espoused when he ran for governor in 2006, when he was a Jeb Bush Republican, when Ronald Reagan was his hero, when he was pro-life, pro-gun, pro-family. He's changed all of those positions. What I hear from Democrats in Broward, which is where I'm from, which is sort of the capital of Democrats in this state, is if you're a hardcore Democrat, they're having a tough time swallowing the Charlie Crist message because they're believers. And what's happening in the Democratic Party now is very similar to what's been happening in the Republican Party over the past 6 or 8 years. The Republican Party got a lot more conservative. the Democratic Party is getting a lot more liberal. So for Charlie, maybe the reason why he's running to the left is because he's afraid that his base won't turn out. And with an unpopular election, which this is turning out to be, it's going to be about who turns out their base. You talked about trust. I would add another T, turnout. Who gets their base out? In the primary in Broward County, with a gubernatorial candidate on the ballot from Broward, Nan Rich, with an attorney general candidate on the ballot from Broward, Perry Thurston, 10.8% turnout in that primary. Lowest turnout we've ever had in a major race. So for Charlie and for Rick, get your base out. Most folks who are in the middle, who are not super voters, going to see all these negative ads, they're going to stay home. So both sides will try to get their base out.
When you look at these issues, is the economy going to be is that the big theme for this governor's race? What are people looking for other than trust and parties, of course, turnout? Is it economy?
Well, I think the good news story of Rick Scott is the economy, but that's not going to be probably the motivator. Whether we like it or not, negative campaigning works. So you see a lot of fighting back and forth about education. How much money did Charlie Crist cut? How much money did Rick Scott cut? What kind of money will be spent on education if either gentleman gets elected? So I think education is always a big issue in Florida. So you'll have the tax issue, I think, will appear too, because Charlie raised taxes when he was governor. Remember, the fees on license plates and driver's licenses went up. You're going to hear about that. You're going to hear about tuition increases under the Crist administration and Florida legislature at the time. Rick Scott's talking about that. So pocketbook issues, yes, and then also education, I think, are the things I'm seeing the most. But then back to your trust point, 4,000 spots run about about Charlie Crist and Scott Rothstein. Charlie Crist has got an ad in response that says Rick Scott and Scott Rothstein are teaming up on me. I mean, both sides probably pushed the envelope on both of those ads, but trust, credibility, character, always big issues in a governor's race.
And of course, the major political parties are looking at this because whoever wins this race in November will be a catalyst for the race for president in 2016.
Absolutely. As Tim Russert used to say, Florida, Florida, Florida. We're the only big state that is a swing state. California is going for the Democrat. Texas is going for the Republican. New York is going for the Democrat. So we're the place where it happens. But we always have to have drama in our races. We have in this race, Charlie Crist, former Republican, former independent Democrat now. And I always say the next race is always crazier than the last. Well, think about this. If you had a Crist election, now you're not only going to have him play in the presidential race, but you could have him impacting Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, either or both of whom may be candidates for president in 2016. So if you like politics as something that you enjoy watching, you're in the right state.
Absolutely. And of course, just half a minute, you're very concerned about the federal budget, federal deficit. You're working a little bit more towards federal issues.
I am, and I'm going to be speaking Monday in Tampa with a group called Fix the Debt. When I was in the U.S. Senate, something I focused on, really my number one issue was the out-of-control spending in Washington. Now, you'll hear people saying things are better because the deficit has been reduced. And that is true, but we have to remember what the deficit is versus the debt. The deficit is, in any particular year, how much more money are we spending than we're taking in. The deficit is shrinking because the economy is getting better and more tax dollars are being paid in. But we're still adding to the debt, which is the overall bill that we owe for borrowing all this money. And right now we're at about $18 trillion. To put this in perspective, our debt was $5 trillion in 2000, $10 trillion in 2010. It'll be $20 trillion by the time this president leaves office. The interest payment is the 5th largest expenditure. We're going to go broke unless we solve those problems.
And you can't deal with military issues without a strong economy, and with $20 trillion in debt, very difficult to do.
Absolutely.
Senator George Lemieux, thanks so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.